You just know when something sounds right, sounds beautiful, like you can feel it in your body. Where source keeping becomes an art is not quite, are you a source keeper? Are you not a source keeper? It's your practice and attunement to finding that, like that resonance, that quality that stays really, really true to the vision in such a way that when you're gathering or magnetizing people towards that vision, like it's more like being drawn to song and feeling your body almost move to that resonance, that shape.
The person who takes the first creative risk is kind of known as the source. That's how you know who the source is because they took the first creative risk to kind of birth a vision out into the world. They took some kind of discrete action. That may or may not accord with some kind of structural authority, but it carries with it a certain kind of creative authority, meaning they have the most intimate connection with the source of the vision.
That which wants to be created is not yours. And at the same time, it is through your hand. It's like it's through your body and you are shaping it and it's going to come through your uniqueness and particularity.
Living in deep relationship with an as soul. And then from
Mm,
that transmission download that enshackles me into a certain dharmic karmic relationship that in a way feels truthfully like enslavement. Because if I
mm,
was to not do that thing, it would cause an immense amount of suffering. And
yes.
so there's not, it's a bit of a choiceless choice. All right. Well, I feel, yeah, delighted, but almost that slightly nervous delighted of feeling like something potentially really beautiful and special and important, something that's meaningful is about to. Um, yeah, I feel honored to be with Daniel Thorson and Cheryl Hsu. We're going to be talking about source keeping, or just exploring source keeping as a framework, but also as a lived and it's a lived embodied experience, also as a maybe a reference point for how we're orienting to some of our projects.
Mm,
Cheryl, Daniel, and myself are sensing into a gathering called Gathering of the Sourcekeepers. And in this call, we're probably not going to explore in too much detail what that gathering is and what it's about. But we wanted to, yeah, just be in relationship together around source keeping. What is source keeping? And how can we actually embody and live into it in the moment as we're exploring it?
mm.
I'll just share, I have an immense amount of gratitude. First off, I actually don't know which one of the, I think I heard source keeping from you, Daniel, but then Cheryl was the one that kind of reminded me of it in a way that invited me to go to, there's a website that we'll link in the show notes called workwithsource.com. And when I read it, I had been source keeping a project for over a year at that point. And I could feel what source keeping was in my bones in my body, but I didn't have the framework and the vocabulary and sort of the conceptual understanding of how to bring that energy into a relationship in a way that others could engage with it. And it was a transformational moment. It was a moment where I remember I was like giddy, I was just like a little boy in a candy shop that felt like I discovered sugar for the first time. And I was just like, you guys, everyone needs to know about this. This tastes amazing. And um, yeah, and that was a transformational moment for the collective, the Boulder Lighthouse Collective that I was stewarding at that point. And really, I think it was a reclamation of power. As I was reflecting this morning, preparing for this call, I was sensing like at the core of it, I feel like source keeping as a framework that I could feel and embody and experience and share and invite others into was kind of a relationship with power in a way that felt clean and clear and ethical or more ethical.
Mm.
Um, and I just want to caveat that I'm still learning about this. That's one of the reasons why I'm excited about having a gathering and having this call right now is to learn and to stumble and to be imperfect with it and to find maybe new novel territory that we could call meta-modern source keeping or liminal source keeping or soul initiated source keeping that maybe is different from the original frameworks. So, yeah, I just want to say welcome everyone who's listening. Welcome to the two of you, Cheryl, Daniel. And just to kick it off, I'm curious, like, as source keeping is dropped into the pond of our field, into our conversational field, what's emerging immediately? Are there any images? Are there any kind of sensations or feelings in your bodies? Yeah, that might be worth just kind of
Hmm.
rippling back.
I think two things come up for me. One is, yeah, just as you were sharing your own kind of first encounter with the concept, I was reflecting on my own journey with it. And I think I'd heard about it some time ago, but then it was Cheryl who really kind of double clicked it for me in our collaborative relationship. And I had a similar experience of really like opening to it and it making a lot of sense of various kind of challenges within the context of collaborative initiatives and projects that I had been in. And it was actually very cathartic to kind of fully receive the concept and frame of source. And it helped me kind of simplify and make into a sort of more have a more elegant relationship to a lot of what were very thorny, um, difficult, and filled with tension like situations with projects and different things that I've been a part of. And so I feel similarly like very grateful for both the concept and to Cheryl for kind of helping initiate me into the frame. And then I'm also with, yeah, a kind of tenderness of just how important this concept has been and for my own development, like what I've learned through holding this as a reference point for my own engagement with various projects that I've been a part of. And then also kind of thinking of the various sort of, I guess, lineage holders that have offered their frame of what source is into the context that Cheryl and I and others have been collaborating in. I'm thinking here of like Peter Koenig and Tom Nixon and Ria Bach and others too who have done their work to clarify this concept and bring it to us. So those are the pieces that are kind of floating in my world.
Hmm.
Yeah, maybe I want to start with the personal too, and kind of describe my relationship with source as something that, yeah, in the practice, or you could say the kind of intersubjective technology that I was involved with, collective presencing, which is Sourcekeep by Ria Bach. What was really interesting about how I came into relating with what source is it's the middle.
Mm.
It's the middle, or the center of any relationship and any relational field. And it can be the center of, in a very like in a very soulful way, the center of the space between myself and soul,
Hmm.
um, and and the kind of mystery, the stream of, yeah, the stream of unfoldment that really wants to come through that center. And then it could be the center between any kind of dyadic relationship, this triad here, what's the center here? And in collective presencing as a practice, there is always this knowing that the bodies and space hold the field, and the transmission comes through the middle, but also comes through the middle, channel through a body.
Mm.
So, in that sense, all bodies, like, and this also feels like kind of like primal yin wisdom. It's like this sense of your body is a well, your body is a channel, and there's a way to tap into a current of transmission or lineages as well. Like maybe there's many different, um, yeah, almost underground currents that one can draw from through the well of your body and speak to and from that. So that was for me, my introduction into speaking to and from the middle, speaking to and from source through the circle of presence. But the mystery and where it started orienting much more creatively and evolve was actually towards um, the potential of a circle of creation. And that was always the, and continues to be the true edge of the practice, which is it's one thing for a group of bodies and space together, people in relationship with one another to be in intimate relating. But there's a point at which the field of potential needs to be almost like seeded and catalyzed into that which wants to be created through. And in that sense, actually, there's always like, it always has to come, like that which wants to be created does need to come through a source keeper. Like you feel it and you're seated with it in your soul. And then you almost become impregnated with that potential and you have to birth it. Like it's like the work of it is to gestate, have your whole body be changed by it. Like find almost like your co-parents or the village, the kinships that form around what wants to be created and could also be part of the body that is wanting to be created. And then in that sense, it's like, yeah, moving through all of, I'm someone who just went through physically like the biological process of pregnancy and birth, but all of the parts of self that resist the metamorphosis, like because pregnancy is a cocoon. And when you're cocooning that soul work, you also have to let so, like, your whole body is almost um, an alchemical vessel, like a container for that which needs to change and be mutated by what you are to become to truly die. And yeah, I think in that sense, source keeping has been this new morphology. Like, what does it mean for someone, say, even at the center, like in a circle, to suddenly call themselves forward and say, like, I am going to initiate this. This is my project to lead. This is mine to source keep. And you also acknowledge, even though I'm the leader and the initiator and the steward, this is not owned by me because I know that I'm tapping into like capital S source, like this current that's so much larger than me, the whole, and I am but someone who is in service to the aliveness that wants to be born. And there's like a trust, and more, there's a trustworthiness to when a source keeper feels like they are in conscious relating with service to the whole, that I'm also feeling very drawn to, almost like in this, yeah. I like it's like I'm wanting to midwife more of these source keepers into their becoming.
Hmm. Why do you want to do that?
Because yeah, it's such a I mean, the immediate response is this is the way. This is the way for, and this is the bold way of putting it, but this is the way for collective awakening. Like you need this, it's not a kind of, it's not the shape of a kind of collectivist, everyone, um, like it's kind of unclear who bears the responsibility and it kind of gets shifted abstractly to the whole. It's actually that everyone feels like their wholeness, um, and therefore their wholeness of responsibility. And there is something almost holographic about it. It's like you can't actually simply feel like you're a part. You actually have to be a whole and assume full like parental stewardship of that wholeness. And that, yeah, it feels, I don't know, like it's like, what does movement look like when it's just wholes in a kind of emergent formation together? And each person needs to find that. Like you can't, you can't force that movement. You can't even direct that movement. It's like it's like the Tao. It's just, it's a pattern that wants to come through. Um, yeah, maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah,
Beautiful.
and I think one of the really generative creative tensions that I've been so grateful for in my relationship with Cheryl is that I feel like I've learned a lot about the sort of esoteric and spiritual dimensions of source and source keeping from her, whereas I tend to hold it in more of a frame of like governance and protocols for network collaboration. So, like, how is it that you can have a kind of distributed authority whereby projects can reliably get done and people can be held accountable for initiatives that exist within the network? And informing my desire for this kind of thing is my experience at Occupy Wall Street, which was, an endeavor to create what was ostensibly a kind of flat, hierarchical-less sort of mode of working together towards a common vision. But what ended up, or what I saw in that subculture was a real failure of authority, meaning that people really weren't able to be held accountable. And so, as Cheryl was alluding to, nobody was accountable. If no individual is taking responsibility for things getting done, then nobody is taking responsibility because we're individuals. Individuals, as my teacher at the monastery used to say, that the reason why a self is useful is because then you have somebody to hold accountable. Like that is the function of a self to some degree, is that now we can say like, oh, you said you were going to do this thing. We now know that, and we can orient towards that way of looking, and that can kind of cohere the whole field with that knowing. And so my deep interest is like, how do you create networks of coordination where things, yeah, like you there's nonetheless like the kind of accountability and power and authority that you might find in more traditionally hierarchical organizations without all of the toxic qualities of that we're so familiar with and that we've rightly kind of deconstructed and moved away from.
Mhm. Does source keeping specifically help to limit or avoid some of those toxic expressions of power?
I think so. Insofar, like one distinction that I think is really helpful is that, as Cheryl was saying, sourcing has to do with um, who is it that takes the first creative risk when it comes to a given initiative. And um, the person who takes the first creative risk is kind of known as the source. That's how you know who the source is because they took the first creative risk to kind of birth a vision out into the world. They took some kind of discrete action. Um, that may or may not accord with some kind of structural authority, but it carries with it a certain kind of creative authority, meaning they have the most intimate connection with the source of the vision, meaning that they have a very clear sense, assuming that they're calibrated as an instrument, to that which is emerging in the field, which may be outside of the vision. So they can clearly point to that and say, like, no, that's actually not it. You're off in this way. And they can articulate it and try to recalibrate the vision for the field. And they can also like affirm that something is very much in accord with the vision. And so they have that kind of creative authority that can help calibrate the whole field to the kind of coherence and integrity of the vision that they're most deeply in touch with. But how the authority flows structurally, that's actually a different question that different organizations will answer in different ways.
Mhm. Yeah, great. And so just to continue to draw a few more contrasts for people that are new to source keeping as a term, one of the I could see there being a way where it's like, well, this sounds a little bit like entrepreneurship. It's someone who kind of has an idea about a cool, app or a project or something, and they go out and they kind of try to make it happen. What are the differences and the distinctions between, say, source keeping and entrepreneurship,
Hmm.
or even being an artist, for example, writing a song?
Hmm.
That's such a juicy question because it demands for more precision and subtlety in what it is. And I want to say that there are entrepreneurs who are source keepers and there are artists who are source keepers. And the distinction is more like when does it when is that resonance alive? Like you can feel someone's vision coming through them, almost like, yeah, like in this, sense of when an artist is channeling the muses. Like the artist, like in a very, in an older sense, there was always like a way of humbling oneself as a vessel to, yeah, to a kind of transcendent, creative daemon or like, yeah, that which wants to be created is not yours. And at the same time, it is through your hand. It's like it's through your body and you are shaping it and it's going to come through your uniqueness and particularity. And I think in that sense, when I feel that in an entrepreneur, like forming an organization or like a company, or when I feel that in an artist forming an art collective, like it could be a very solo, solitary sense of a project that wants to be born, and it can be something that's like at scale, like a whole movement, like an Occupy Wall Street. But there is, I think, where it kind of like shades into, oh, this feels more true. This feels more, it's like song, like when you listen to something and it's just the resonance of it feels more harmonized. Like there's more of this,
Mm.
you just know when something sounds right, sounds beautiful. Like it, you can feel it in your body. And you can also feel when something like f sounds off.
Mhm.
Like you don't have to have perfect pitch to know when something sounds like a little bit distorted, essentially. So for me, like where source keeping becomes an art is not quite, are you a source keeper? Are you not a source keeper? It's your practice and attunement to finding that like that resonance, that quality that stays really, really true to the vision in such a way that when you're gathering or magnetizing people towards that vision, like there, it's more like being drawn to song, and feeling your body almost move to that resonance, that shape.
Mm.
So, and I think for me, it's like beauty. Maybe this is why it feels like an art form. Beauty is a portal to what is also true and what is also good. And remembering that we have these bodies that can actually, like, through sense, through sensuality, through a kind of, yeah, embodied erotic knowing, it's like this feels more right. Like, how do we reclaim that way of knowing that I think, like, so it's like so much of that capacity has been kind of dismembered from us because I mean, I could go on for all the reasons why that's the case, but this feels like a remembering of
Mm.
that.
Mm.
That's beautiful. And I would say that to Cheryl's point, there's a way that at least as Tom Nixon talks about source, that it's actually a kind of description of how things work. So you can look at any initiative or project and like interview people and kind of figure out like, oh, like where did this vision, what body did this vision originally come from? And then identify the source. Um, but there's a question of whether or not, one, that person acknowledges that they are kind of the source keeper of that initiative, and then also whether or not the people who are participating in that field recognize that person as the source. And the what I've noticed is that if that person and that field recognize that, that affords more of that kind of harmonic resonance quality such that the creative vision can come into more beautiful integrity and like wholeness over time. That it's when the person who is source either under identifies with that, meaning doesn't take responsibility for their part in fully bringing the creative vision into life, or when they over identify with it and kind of clamp down on it and kind of get rigid about it or think try to source with their mind, that breaks the aliveness of the creativity that is trying to be birthed through them. Or when they, and this often happens, like they try to give it away too quickly to the field and say like, no, it's all of ours. And then it kind of becomes this hodgepodge, bricolage that actually loses the integrity of the original vision, often because the source person, didn't know better and or had a fear of authority or was afraid to stand up for what they really felt and believed in. And this is part of the kind of we say the developmental offering of source keeping is that it helps us step into more of our power and kind of get whittled down by the slings and
Hmm?
arrows that inevitably come at us as we try to do what we know is right. And that might, people might have their opinions, even people that love us deeply or that we care about a lot.
Hmm. Beautifully said. I have done all three of those in my short time.
Me too.
Yeah,
Me too.
I'll link to an article I just published. It's a 2-year reflection on the Boulder Lighthouse Collective. And yeah, just when you articulated those three, Daniel, I was like, wow, there were such distinct moments of falling into all three of those. And one thing that I want to keep asking, I love asking questions and then hearing back something that I might say, but hearing it even more deliciously spoken. And you both are doing that. And it's just been really a delight to receive the transmission from both of you. One other clarifying question I had is, there's a friend of mine who just messaged me a couple of days ago, and he just started to make a little prototype of a dating app that is specifically for the liminal web kind of meta modern integral scene. And I've heard this idea 5, 6, 7 times before. Almost at every conference I've been to, people are talking about how important that is. But this friend actually like made a very rough mock-up of it. And so would he be the source keeper of this idea? Like how do you, because that it seems like it's an idea that's already in the collective ether, but he took that first
Yes.
creative act to actually make it more than just an idea or an expression. Does that therefore make him the source keeper?
Yeah, and this is something that Tom Nixon writes a little bit about, and I think Cheryl and I have talked about this, but I certainly have the view that like these creative potentials are sort of like flowing around in different bodies, and then a body will take the risk to actually try to bring it into the world, and then they become the source keeper. Now, it may be that like the potential like actually finds birth in multiple bodies, and that vision gets obviously like art kind of brought into the world in different ways through multiple bodies. So maybe there's somebody that's making that dating app that you don't even know who kind of got the same message and they're source keeping a different instance of that same like creative vision.
Yeah,
But yeah, that person in this case would be the source of that project.
yeah, yeah, beautiful. Hmm. Yeah, sure. I was just so moved in my actual body, like my cells were moving and dancing when you were speaking about beauty and the transmission of feeling the embodiment of resonance and almost using that as a compass. And yeah, that this matches my experience so closely. It's almost like, when you go to sort of a yoga class and you kind of find that perfect posture where you're in alignment and everything, and you're just kind of moving slowly until you just sort of, it all kind of clicks in. And there's a way when I'm in relationship with source keeping and in relationship with, say, a project or an initiative, that it's almost just like slowly moving the muscles and the energy. And then there's just a moment where things click and
Mhm.
and I call that the yes, like, oh, that I got the yes. And it's all a spectrum as well, right? Like sometimes I feel like it can be an explosive yes, where it's like, this is such a yes that there are volcanoes erupting in the cosmos, and you must act upon this now. And sometimes it's a whisper of a yes, or it's like a yes, it's a yes, and there could also be other yeses, and so keep exploring. It's almost like a violin, like there's many different chords and strings, and the way that you can work with the different yeses, the yes echoes, you could say, from source when in relationship with source keeping, feels beautiful, because in a way it's like each small step is one yes, but then they all are kind of co-creating this larger mosaic, and then that mosaic is filling out a larger image. And often I find it's like a snake eating its own tail, in a sense of like the original image kind of becomes fractalized into many different potentialities. But then when you go deep enough into that, it reveals the full image again, and then it sort of fractalizes, and it has this very dynamic aliveness to it. And it's almost like the whole image is only necessary to consciously remember in an imaginal or a conceptual way, when it's like a North Star, like the star comes out every night and you remember, like, oh yes, we're in this giant universe. And then they go away and you're kind of just in the daily grind of making it happen. And then you kind of come back to this moment of deeply sort of encountering the fullness of the vision of the source as it's living and breathing and embodying um,
Yeah.
our day-to-day moments. So yeah, and there was just a little bit of what was coming up, and I'm curious about, for the two of you, like in your own kind of direct, lived, embodied experience, what's happening right now in your relationship to source keeping, with the projects, with your new child, Cheryl? Like where are the boundaries and the borders of what you're sourcing now, and how is it living in your direct experience?
Mm. Mm. Yeah, maybe I'll say, um, one dimension that comes to mind is in a lot of my collaborative relationships now, I think one of the skills I'm really leaning into is identifying when source is moving in one of my collaborators, and then how do I relate to them in a way that really supports them in their creative agency in relationship to what they're sourcing. So like recognizing them really clearly so that they can see what potential is arising in them and kind of really give the appropriate nourishment to it so that it can live in the world. That's really fun, and I am really loving that. And then yeah, it's exactly like you say, Tucker. I think there's this term in the contemplative traditions of becoming like a hollow tube, right?
Mhm.
Meaning getting all of the kind of things in the way of that clear signal out of the body so that you can just follow the next step. And that to me is like a lot of the art of source keeping is, you know, um, it's actually the daily practice of kind of cleaning the vessel, making sure that you're available for inspiration, making sure that you've done the work to undistort your motivational system so that you're acting from love instead of fear and egoic self-protection. And that is an endless process. And the thing I really appreciate about this framework is that it kind of clarifies the arena. Like, if you want to fully birth in integrity the creative initiative that your soul is calling you to, then this is what you must do. You got to do the work to clarify your desire and make each day and each action an offering that is coming from love and that kind of clarity that can be trusted. And then you can, with that, like, the way that that sort of creates a field effect where each person that participates in your creative field can then also align to their own creative agency. And as you say, like, in a way, nobody actually has access to the full picture. Nobody knows what's going on, but there's a trust that if we all kind of align ourselves like that, we can sort of distributedly paint a picture that is just gonna amaze the world. And so, that is really my interest, is like, yeah, how do I create the conditions for that to kind of become a field effect, for the collaborative relationships and projects that I'm a part of
Mm.
and that I'm sourcing.
Mm.
Mm. Yeah, I really appreciate the description of the hollow tube and that quality of kind of like the yoga alignment when everything clicks into place. And it's so delicious when it happens. And my experience of having kind of like aligned into the stream of source, I've described it with another collaborator of mine is we'll experience it like we're on the tip of a wave and everything, and it's really, really high and it's moving really fast, but we're right on the lip of it. And it's very much like surfing. It's really smooth and you can feel the power of the wave beneath you, but you're not pushing. You're just riding it. But you're also aware, and this is where I mean, the other image that also comes up is like finding that eye of the storm. It's like that still point where everything is moving with such intensity and force. And you know that once you find that center, you're dancing with it. And the thrill and danger of it is you're also so aware that once you come out of alignment, it will throw you off. And I think that's where, I don't know, as we're moving more and more into source keeping fields, and I want to say kind of like attractors, like these projects that want to come into being of greater and greater power and potential. Um, like I feel like there is something about you're working with energy that is amplifying anything that is still stuck within the system. So you want to actually start like you want to start small, but you're actually given exactly often you're given exactly what is almost cosmically designed to stretch you and have you see all of the karmic knots that are in your system. And like it takes you right to the edge of clearing your distortions by amplifying them so you can see it. So it's almost, yeah, there's like a way in which that alchemical vessel, I don't know, sometimes it feels like a nuclear reactor as well. It's designed to hold power.
Yes.
Um, and I want, like, the other piece of it is in that way that it's source keepers as part of this larger kind of murmuration, like a movement of many source keepers. Like in my experience, and this is where I think I constellate to find the others who also hold this pattern in them. And I feel this in you, Daniel, and you, Tucker, and like finding the others as well. There are source keepers who are holding a very particular pattern of knowing that their source is deeply connected with this deeper pattern where other source keepers are also part of that larger puzzle. And there's, I feel like in all of the projects that each source keeper I know, including myself, initiates, there's always a point where you're owning something, but you're also wanting to activate the others that you invite into your field into a kind of sourceship as well, into a source keeping. And in my own learning, where it becomes yeah, it's like such a dance where you have to stay on this kind of like sliver of a middle path is you both want folks to enter your sourced field, like your arena, your game, but you also need them to like enter it by finding their own source and creating their own arena so that their arena and your arena are able to find this kind of like, yeah, I don't know, it's a kind of fluid dynamic where it amplifies. Like if all of us are in our own kind of like arenas and it's humming and it's resonating when they meet. There's a whole other field effect that happens where not any one person is sourcing that, but it's coming out of the very intimate encounter of these fields in relationship with one another. And that is, I mean, when I speak about it, it feels like a kind of, it's like a longing for a kind of, I don't know, something that is like I can taste it, but it feels like paradise in a way. It's like you
Mm,
get glimpses of it, you feel it, but I mean, it feels like also, yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
I want to ride on that and just say that like yeah, this is so alive for me. The way that source keeping is so much about like kind of fractal right relationship, right? So in Tom Nixon's frame of source, you know, and everybody is kind of a sub-source already from the ground of being the creative font of all projects, you know, you might say. And then within a field, somebody can arise that is sourcing a particular like component of that project and identifying that person and kind of coming into right relationship with them so that they take full creative agency within the context of the field that perhaps you're sourcing is a whole art. And it's so important and so beautiful. But then, as Cheryl is saying, if you're sourcing something and you encounter somebody else who's sourcing a different project, finding the right relationship with that project so that harmony can start to and the harmonic fields can start to generate across different sourced projects. That's part of the kind of dream I think that I felt with you, Tucker, in this gathering is that perhaps by bringing together people who are kind of seeing themselves in this frame, we can start to find each other and align our creative initiatives into some kind of tensegrity that would
Mm.
allow them to more robustly emerge and become more whole in their expression.
Mhm. Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's 100 things I want to say. But I think, to get to the essence of it, what it feels like for me is lovemaking.
Mm,
It's like when my deepest joy and my soul pleasure is just alive and it's like a cauldron of power and eros. And then when it comes into relationship with another that wants to dance with that and to meet in intimacy and to share like our most precious, yet also our most strong and powerful expressions, but also our most, that it comes with also a deep vulnerability and like a seeing of our soul, and there's a preciousness in that. And to me, it just feels like so close to physical lovemaking.
mm,
It's creative lovemaking with the cosmos through the uniqueness of our individuality that meets the individual context and the people that we're coming into relationship with as a collective. And there's just something about it that um, it's like it's an endless power supply of flow, you know? It's like some people go kind of rock climbing to get to that place where they're just at their growth edge and they're just trying to kind of reach past and they enter into this state of just sort of effortlessness. And yeah, in my experience, there is a way to do our quote unquote work in the world from a place of creative flow state as the ground of as the baseline, you could say. And of course, sometimes like in rock climbing, you fall or you stumble or you scrape your knee and there's a way in which that's all part of this larger kind of creative flow that is like you were saying, it's hollowing us out, it's finding the places where we can become more polished or show up and learn and be in relationship with a deeper wisdom that's wanting to come online. Um, yeah, it's just I just want to take a moment to honor Bill Plotkin, who doesn't speak about source keeping in the frameworks that we've been talking about through the other lineages, but he really initiated me into the idea of living in deep relationship with an as soul. And then
mm,
from that kind of like transmission download that enshackles me into a certain dharmic karmic relationship that in a way feels truthfully like enslavement. Because if I
Mm.
was to not do that thing, it would cause an immense amount of suffering. And
Yes.
so there's not, it's a bit of a choiceless choice, you know, like I could potentially not do the thing that source is telling me to do, but it would feel like opening the door to hell in a way. And so it's it's yeah, there's a transcendent quality to it where it's beautiful and there's music that we're playing as our, expressions of goodness make their way out as the resonance of truth that's meeting the other resonances of goodness, truth, and beauty. And there's a way in which it's like, holy fuck, like my soul is here kind of enslaved in this being that is in relationship with this possibility that wants to come through. And I have to kind of wake up every day and just live that. And that is everything. There's all experiences are wrapped up in that one thing, which
Mhm.
is kind of it's a trip. It's a trip.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say that that is part of the design, as I understand it, is that, you know, the way I've sometimes framed it is like you do the work to the soul work to clarify your what you're sourcing, and then you see how essential it is that you offer that to the world, and then you do your absolute best to offer that with as much clarity as you can, and then you get broken, you
Mm,
Mm,
get destroyed because you do your best and you fail, and in that failing you shatter, and in that shattering you clarify. And it could be that the purpose of your sourcing is simply to get you to the point where you break.
mm,
And that's actually beautiful. That's
mm,
actually fully worth it. And so when we receive a vision, we don't actually know what the embodiment, the articulation in the world will be. We just have to move in integrity with it. And it may just be that that's the way our soul brings us into position to be broken in exactly the way that is needed.
mm,
mm.
mm, mm.
Yeah, there's something that feels remarkably vulnerable here because your description is exactly how I would describe having a baby right now
Mhm.
and being in relationship with my son, who is, yeah, like my son, but also not mine. Like it feels like, in the sense, and I want to honor Rob Bea, who is,
Mm.
yeah, he describes kind of similarly cosmopoesis, and it feels like we're all in a lineage here, like both Bill Plotkin and Robert Bea and others. Like there's this soul making practice that like comes from esoteric, yeah, like a kind of relating with the imaginal realm. Like there's a mysticism actually to the work of source keeping, um, that
Mhm.
is about relating with the potential that lies in a divine space.
Mm.
Um, and I don't know where my baby came from. Like, where did Io come from? Like, it does feel like he came as what kind of Hillman describes as like acorn with an oak tree enfolded in him.
Mm.
And it is my work to birth him, but also like I can't control or like determine who he's going to be. Yeah, I can only like it's like my work in a very humble way of first allowing him to be my teacher. So
Mm.
allowing him to break me down, like shatter me in the ways that my egoic identity wants to be attached to. It's like, this is who I am. It's every day, every moment, this baby is breaking me down, but he's breaking me down into becoming the person I'm meant to be in relationship with who he's meant to be. And that for me is like this art of right relating. Like it's not, he wasn't born and I figured out who I was. It's like we are working on each other right now.
Mm.
And that has been that is like such a dojo. And that's the dojo that it feels like I'm being asked to bring to every relationship.
Mhm.
And here, um, I mean, it's happening in the most intimate way, like a mother-child relationship. But I imagine there's so many different configurations where you have to find that. Like what is the kind of, I mean, it's described as the theophanic relationship, like this like the divine relationship that actually wants to call forward the most numinous potential of right relating. Like
Mm.
how do I call you forward in your most numinous potential and vice versa? And it's going to happen through the soul work. It's going to happen through you also bringing up all of my deepest wounding and my shadow stuff and my attachments. And it's just, and they go in tandem with one another. And that's kind of the torture and also kind of, yeah, aliveness of it.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, and I feel like in addition to that destruction and that torture, there's also an inherent goodness that I found where maybe I'll just be, really full on and at my wit's end. And then there's just a moment where it feels like Source is like, Tucker, take a nap, you know? And I'm like, wow. Like, wow. And now I'm not just taking a nap because I'm just taking a nap. I'm taking a nap because that's right relationship with Source. And that's an exquisite nap, you know? And there is a sense where, you know,
Exactly.
we're all source keeping our soul's expression here on the earth. And so in a way, living life as source keeping, it's a frame. You could say it's more than a frame though. It's an embodied experience, an embodied relationship with how we can be in reality with reality as it's unfolding us. And then there's, source keeping specific projects or specific initiatives. And then maybe there's source keeping, Cheryl, I'm hearing this in you of like source keeping every moment, like every moment is an opportunity to be in relationship with what is and to
Mm.
feel into the center and to feel where aliveness is and to move and flow with it, which paradoxically might sometimes mean moving with a contraction or moving into the stuckness or really fully allowing yourself to feel the like I'm fucking done with this bullshit, like that also can be part of the flow. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, just kind of sensing there's different timelines, there's different
Mm.
there's different dimensions at play. We can have
Yeah.
we can source keep our relationship with source itself, which is to me a deep act of faith. It's a process of creating a deeper and deeper level of faith and trust. And I would say faith is kind of like a transcendent knowing that's there in it's not even a felt sense, it's a knowing sense that is beyond sensorial experience. And then trust is like the embodied experience of embodying that faith in each moment or each relationship. So yeah, there's so much to this and it's so juicy, and I just wanted to bring in some of those other dimensions.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think to your point, Tucker, that like, it's important to recognize that every individual is the source of their life, right? And that part of what's so powerful about this concept is that it helps us ground our creative agency in such a way that it clarifies the nature of the situation that we're in.
Mm.
And one of the real challenges that I've had in my own process and that I see facing our larger network is a kind of failure of agency, a kind of like unwillingness to step definitively into the fact that you are the source of your life and the source of your creative initiatives and the choices that you make, and really like full on taking responsibility. There's a kind of like dodging of the terror of
Mm.
that reality. And so the reason I really like building projects in which this is, kind of the core, like primordial metaphysics or something like that, is that it just helps us really get clear. That's where we're starting from. Like that is, we just need to hold that close because, in my view, that's actually how it is. And so if we pretend that it's not that way, we're going to suffer.
Mm.
But if we acknowledge that this is how it is and really take it on as a kind of alchemical process, then the suffering that we will experience will be in the service of our clarification. And that is how suffering ought to be.
Mhm. Yeah.
And then suffering becomes ennobling, you know.
Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah,
mm,
there's an interesting paradox in that, and that the suffering is sometimes almost more intense because there's more intimacy with it. And simultaneously, there's an aspect of self that is like relaxed and released into the suffering, which somehow makes it less uh, painful when, well, not painful, but there's a softness to the sharpness. That's the only way I can describe it.
Exactly. And that's kind of how partly like the soul making aspect of how to work with suffering is that it creates the conditions for that to be like alchemized or transmuted in that way. Exactly.
Yeah. How does somebody listening to this recording, um, I want to say no, and I don't mean necessarily know whether, it makes sense in the conceptual framework that we're putting forth, but how does one know in their lived experience whether they are sourcing an initiative, and like if there's a lack of clarity, if that full kind of yes, obviously this is what my experience is, how can one be in relationship with the mystery or the curiosity and maybe come into some of that deeper clarity that can help them go forth in the world?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, partly I think the way I would orient is to be able to really meaningfully quote answer that question requires a certain degree of clarification of the interior, such that you can distinguish between like what my mind is telling me is true and like what is true according to the signal that's coming through the hollow tube. And so like that process is, a lot of the fruits of the path and a lot of the fruit of inner work. And so, if you don't know the difference between those two, then the work is clear. You need to do the work to distinguish between those two. If you can distinguish between those two, then, talking to a friend or like kind of feeling back into the kind of origin point of a project and like, did it come through my body? Was there a moment when it sort of like emerged into the world through me? And can you kind of remember back there and even like touch that again in your soma so that it kind of comes to life again? And then might have more evidence that you might be source if you can remember your way back to that kind of moment. And that can be a great conversation to have with your collaborators. Kind of like, how did this happen? How did this come out? How did this come to life? Like through which body? Um, and then see how that affects the field if you kind of clarify that.
mm. Yeah, there's this practice that we're kind of experimentally embodying around what it means to clarify one's desire. Like clarify, and for me, there's also this sense of like it's like a purifying fire. Desire is not all like we have this way of thinking that we own our desires, but the source of desire, the source of aliveness, when you kind of follow and really trace the roots down, there you trace it down to like a source that is deeply mysterious. Like what what makes you like what is the impulse of falling in love? What draws you close to another being? Like what makes it's just like you aren't being moved.
Mm.
And one's capacity to be able to see clearly and a willingness, like a conscious willingness to see clearly. And I kind of borrow this like from spiritual practice as well, like this way of can you I think Benita Roy would call it like seeing perfectly because everything seen perfectly is loved. Can you love? Can you include within your field of love, your field of acceptance, like everything that you're seeing all the way down so that that desire, like whatever's motivating how you move, like in a very embodied material way in the world, is coming from the deepest roots of your being. And that is, I mean,
Mm.
you're just going to, I think the thing that's like hardest right now for folks, including myself, is seeing the ugliest, like seeing the most intolerably ugly, shameful um, parts of like self, other, and world. Like that's what intimacy is. It's e like I can love all the things that are easy to love about you, but where the work is including all the everything that feels impossible actually to love. And that's where that edge is. Because, I mean, yeah, yeah. That's it feels like that's the work right now. And that's the technology of love. And I don't, it's so funny to use the word technology and to bring that in a kind of, yeah, it almost feels like, is that wrong in a way? But actually, I do feel like love is there's like something about it where there's a process in it. There's like a
Yeah.
true kind of divine techne in it that is working on you, and like allowing that to actually happen is that process of clarification.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Also,
yeah. Daniel, would you be willing to double click a bit on the architecture that you were bringing up at the earlier on the call? And is there a practical example, potentially the church or a specific project that you're source keeping where you might be able to just kind of like paint a little bit more of a on the ground structural example of what source keeping looks like in action?
yeah, the best way to approach source that I've found from a kind of structural perspective is through Tom Nixon's work, which we referenced, Work with Source. And he actually has a kind of organizational mapping tool called MapTO, which allows you to map an organization according to hierarchically embedded source authority flows. And so, as we said, like if you consider the whole initiative to be a creative field that's sourced by one person, there's subsources that can source all like infinitely into more like subfields of source. And so that's a way of doing kind of distributed hierarchical authority, creative authority that can make kind of elegant, very distributed fields, elegant kind of flows of authority in distributed fields. And so I would recommend checking out his work and checking out that mapping software, because if you look at it, you can kind of get a quick visual sense of how that can clarify the flows in an organization of authority.
Okay. Is there an example or a moment from either of your two projects or initiatives where the source keeping frame wasn't either you hadn't implemented that or it wasn't fully being enacted, and then there was a moment where like it came into right relationship and something clicked into place or something changed in the field or in the actual structure of the project, the collective that made an impact?
Hmm. I think I just want to say that there's something it feels like there's some pattern of eternal recurrence that we're trying to break right now. And it feels like on the brink. And the reason why I'm just saying this is because actually both Daniel and I have been kind of involved in multiple projects where source keepers have had to learn what it means to, yeah, it's like what it is to kind of like take that on. And I've just we like I feel like both of us and yourself included, Tucker, and your writing of what it's been like to source the Lighthouse Collective. It's like the failure modes are very, very clear. There's something about it. Um, And specifically, it's in the transition point because I think we know the transition point where source is takes on that role of initiating, a kind of like, yeah, I want to say like a classic beacon of leadership, a kind of clarity of vision that can call in others. Like there's something that we definitely understand about that kind of visionary leadership, but there's something in a kind of there's the next step of the evolution or the metamorphosis that like I can feel us wanting to move towards, but it's like getting a little bit stuck up, and it's where that source almost like moves from the body of one individual, like one person, towards more of a center, but where the source is still source. It's kind of like a weird parallax
Mhm.
where you're not letting go of the authority, but you're also shifting, you're almost shifting the attractor more towards a center where others are also able to access it, but you're still stewarding it at the same time. And Daniel and I have actually been calling it like there's been a shape of it that feels like a line and a circle where you're, and for me, it's like a kind of toroidal form because there's a
Mhm.
way in which the vision actually needs to be held by collectives. Like the vision is too big for any one person to hold, but each of those each of those bodies in a kind of circular field are also lines. Like you are also the center of the field at the same time. So somehow you have to be, yeah, like you have to be in a configuration where in within a project, how does the transition happen where that line moves, yeah, like moves into the inclusion of a circle that can birth more lines. Like,
Mhm.
and I'm describing it like this geometry, but honestly, that's how it shows up. For me, it's like there's some kind of, yeah, like a tensegrity that happens
Yes.
where all of like the eruption of new potentials, new possibilities through bodies starts to happen. But there's like a dying process that needs to happen in the source to unleash it.
Mhm.
Well said. Yeah, and I would just say like this is, and I don't think this has happened yet on the planet, but this is how I feel like a mass movement that is organized according to source principles will emerge,
Mhm.
right? We have like small scale sourced organizations that we can look at, but Tom Nixon at least felt an urgency to articulate this body of work in response to the failures of Extinction Rebellion, where Gail Bradbrook was the source, but then she lost her creative authority within as the movement began to scale, and then the movement kind of like wiggled and decohered. And so, how do you create that kind of massive movement of potential while keeping this kind of harmonic integrity? And I think what Cheryl is alluding to is that there's some kind of mutation that we haven't quite figured out yet that might make that possible.
Yeah. Do you have a hard out at the top of the hour, or can we go just a couple more minutes?
I could
I-
go a couple minutes.
Yeah,
Okay.
a couple.
Write it down. Yeah. Yeah, I just want to say, Cheryl, what you were speaking to happened in the Lighthouse Collective group, and it was because you had reminded me of work with Source, and I don't know how it happened. I would love to go back in time or in my memory and study, but there was some moment where I was holding a rope and I just loosened it like this, and then somehow everybody else seemed to hold their own rope more tightly and more gently, and then the whole
Mm,
collective was like this.
mm,
Um, it was one being. We became one being finally, and we were always one being finding itself, but the one being could recognize itself through each individual node of that being, and then be in relationship with itself, mostly 99% unspoken in an energetic, kind of just a deep body attuned way. And all of a sudden, other people started stepping up and leading in ways that were exactly what the original vision called for, but um, I hadn't yet risk failing enough to let go of the power that was preventing that move from happening. And the irony is that I think that if I had done that any sooner than that exact moment when I did, I remember the moment very clearly. It happened on one evening. I think it wouldn't have worked. And so I can't take any credit for this, but because I was just sort of listening, I was like, I can't let go of the rope yet. I can't let go of the rope yet. I know this is my ego. I know this is also my shadow. Yeah. And then it just happened when it happened. And it's weird. It's very weird because it's like magic, you know, it's like it's some weird magic trick that is a
Mm.
blessing. Yeah. Yeah. And I just want to say, you know, Daniel, when you were speaking earlier too, I was thinking of there's a way in which can all find these labels to create more self-importance and all this. And for some reason, I feel like in most of the time, it just feels really humbling because it feels like I'm actually the one that is sort of the mystery that is of service to this thing that I am kind of blessed and cursed with simultaneously. And a lot of times when I'm making decisions, I don't feel like I'm making decisions. I just feel like I'm being in the truth of truth, if that makes sense. And yeah, I could see how that even just saying that could come off as really whatever. But it's it's the best I got for now.
Hmm.
Mm.
I'm curious, just as we close in this last minute or two, is there anything that feels incomplete or that feels like it's still murmuring in your bellies that wants to be spoken or would be important to include in this dialogue?
Yeah, maybe I'll, it's like kind of final check out. For me, a really succinct way of describing source keeping is about unleashing creative agency. There is, because source keeping is still in relationship with other ways of being as well, but in particular with source keeping, when one comes into relating with creative agency and says yes to the call and says yes to kind of like the servitude almost as you're describing, like it can feel like you're chained to something. It's a choiceless choice. But once you claim that yes and that soul alignment, there is like you're a creative agent that is in right relationship with cosmos. Like
Mhm.
there's a way in which the cosmos is just a teemingness of creativity. It's like aliveness just constantly foaming and becoming,
Mhm.
and like there's like a moreness to it. And to be, and I think there's something right now in our culture where it's like the reclaiming of creative agency and that kind of clarified empowerment that feels like it's also healing, like our wound around power
Hmm.
is really, really important because creativity is actually like our birthright as alive beings. Like we're participating in something that's part of like a cosmic whole. So, yeah, just something around that remembrance of our like creative inheritance, our creative birthright is really important. But
Hmm.
again, tethered. It's tethered to the whole.
Hmm.
So, yeah, thank you.
Beautiful. Mhm.
And, hmm,
Anything on your end, Daniel?
I don't want to follow that. That was good
You're
mic
you're a
moment.
smart man. You're a smart man. Well,
Yeah.
I'll just say if you're listening to this recording and you feel resonance and aliveness or curiosity, I invite you to reach out to me. I'm be happy to receive your message or your inquiry. And yeah, I just to me it feels really fun to meet people that are um, humming a similar tune in a similar frequency, but through the uniqueness of their own instrument. And there's just like a, yeah, there's no other place in the entire universe I'd rather be than right here, right now. And to me, that's like the feeling of home, home with that capital H. And yeah, I'm just really grateful to be home with you two in this moment. Um, I'm excited to see where its source keeps itself to next. Thank you both.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Tucker.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dave.